Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about Turkey and the new Sultan that sits there, or the wannabe Sultan. Austin, you've written several articles on Erdogan. The best was probably the ego Sultan. What is going on with Erdogan, and what are his goals and his desires for Turkey?
Look, I addressed, addressed this a little bit in the biography I did of Kemal Ataturk for Macmillan, which came out in 2011. But I got asked this question straightforward in a symposium I attended at Stanford in October of 2017. And here's what, I know this sounds novelistic, but I think this gets at something about the psychology of Erdogan. Jim says we're going to have to deal with paranoia here. Megalomania is a form of paranoia. I think he's jealous of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and he wants to be the greatest modern figure in Turkish politics. Part of the reason his animus to Ataturk is Ataturk was a secularist, and Erdogan, somewhere back there, is an Islamist. He's a peculiar type of Islamist. He doesn't have anything in common with Al Qaeda. His security forces, just like Turkish security forces of the past, fight them and kill them, and sometimes we suspect assassinate Al Qaeda operatives. So do the Israelis. There's some common cause there. But that said, Erdogan has been slowly, since he came to power, first as prime minister, and then he created really manipulation, a strong presidency, and now he's president. A lot of shenanigans in the elections, and he's centered power on himself. He really has using a democratic or semi-democratic process, created an authoritarian presidency, which just fits his authoritarian personality to a T. Now, we can get into this a bit later. That curious coup of July 2016 certainly fed into his fears that the military was eventually going to act against him, because of the way Ataturk set up his democratic orientation is a term that Andrew Mango, his greatest biographer, came up with, setting Turkey on a path to a genuine parliamentary democracy, as he feared the Islamists would, Muslim authoritarians, would undermine Turkey's secular republic. So he wanted the military, no, it's your job to act to protect the secular republic against a return of Muslim authoritarianism. He's Erdogan defanged the military, and then comes the curious coup. We've talked about that a little bit before on past strategy talks, but of July 2016, which if it was a coup, then the Turkish military doesn't know how to pull a coup off anymore. He used that coup, Erdogan did, as a way to purge the government, purge all sectors of Turkish society of his political opponents. And yes, he's paranoid in the megalomaniacal sense, and paranoid in the sense that he thinks he's threatened from all, particularly by the military, but by Turkish Democrats. That's Democrat with a little d. Curiously enough, maybe not so curiously, there has been pushback from the Republican People's Party, CHP, which was Ataturk's party. Center right is what it's usually described that way, and within the elections that have occurred this year in primarily in Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, the three big cities in Turkey, he's unpopular. If there was a snap election, there's a chance that his Justice and Development Party, the AKP, would lose its majority in Parliament, and that would mean that there could be a snap election to replace Erdogan, and he's afraid of that. And he should be afraid of it. One of the unique things about Turkey is that it's overwhelmingly Muslim nation, but it's also, well, it's been a secular democracy, and Erdogan has gone about undermining it. But what brings us here, we'll talk. I just already sketched some of the political records since 2002. That's when the AKP won a national election, and they came into power in 2003. They've been in power since then, and Erdogan's been the boss. One other thing I'll say about Erdogan, and I'm paraphrasing what he said in a speech in the 1990s. It ultimately ended up getting him jailed for, I forget the actual charge, but it amounted to treasonous language. He said, democracy is just a train we ride until we get off at the station. That's a big paraphrase. It's rather elegant the way he actually said it, meaning that we're riding it, and then when we get off, we'll be in control. And the last election is when my Islamist party wins, and we assume control. He's disavowed that statement now, but he is still angry about being arrested and jailed in the 1990s. He has no problem arresting and jailing his opponents, particularly journalists. I think right now, Turkey under Erdogan has got, well, again, it's hard to know how many people are actually jailed in China and Russia and the like, but in open societies, I think in open societies where we can get good figures, I think Turkey leads the number of journalists in prison. And most of them are people who've written or articles condemning Erdogan. Several of these journalists have been in jail before, and then they get out, and then they are sent back to jail. So it's not a pretty picture, Dan. At the same time, Turkey, for the most part, has lived up to its NATO requirements, and Incirlik Air Base in southeastern Turkey is still one of NATO's major air bases. Supply flights to Afghanistan, surveillance flights all over Central Asia and the Mediterranean, and even Eastern Europe are based out of that air base. It's extremely important to NATO in the entire southeastern sector and North Africa and Persian Gulf. One other point, I'll just toss this out. At that conference at Stanford, one of the things I was asked was what happens if we lose Incirlik? And I one of the things I tossed out, I'm not the first person to think of it, is the British air bases in the British sovereign base zones on Cyprus. They're also well located for that kind of of air support. The thing is that Incirlik is bigger and can handle all of the NATO requirements. You really don't want to lose it, but you have to consider it given Erdogan's behavior. The best outcome would be for his party, the AKP, to lose, and he'd be tossed out of power. I'll just leave it there. I think I've given you the answer. He wants to be. I called him an ego sultan. He doesn't like being called Sultan Recep, which is, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is his name, and the Sultan always gets called by his first name. So that's right. It ticks him off, and I think that's good. He shouldn't. Yeah.
Now, one of the things, Jim, that Erdogan has caused is a collision between the F-35 and the S-400. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, nobody can really understand what he's up to there. By accepting the S-400, and delivery started last week, I've flown in. He's basically cutting himself off from the F-35 program. Not only was Turkey buying some F-35s, but as part of that deal, Turkish firms were manufacturing some of the components, some of the structural components. Now, that can be shifted to another manufacturer. That's not high tech. I mean, it's difficult to switch, but it's no big deal. He apparently cannot make up his mind, as Austin pointed out. Do you want to be in NATO or do you not want to be in NATO? He has his people, going by the book. I'm sure his military advisors are telling him, or even including the ones he trusts. I mean, he doesn't really trust a lot of people in the military. That you can't trust the Russians. They are an ancient enemy. I mean, and there's reasons for that. And he doesn't have, as Austin points out, the full support of his own government. Let me put it succinctly. He has the Muslim Brotherhood disease. I mean, that pretty much sums it all up. The Muslim Brotherhood was an organization, a moderate Muslim rule, as it were, in Egypt in the 1920s. The problem with the Muslim Brotherhood is it cannot escape the fundamental problem with all efforts to, come up with a way to have Islamic rule, in other words, by Islamic law, without being co-opted or having your operation destroyed by the fanatics. And a current example of that was in Egypt in 2011. The Muslim Brotherhood had basically been, much reduced after a outbreak of violence involving the radical faction of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and that was put down with great violence. And the Muslim Brotherhood became very unpopular with the Egyptian people, who basically agreed with a lot of the basic ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, less corruption, honest government. But in 2011, the Arab Spring, Egypt was one of the places where Mubarak, the old, military dictator, was overthrown. Well, I mean, he's democratically elected, but the elections were rigged. But, that's an old story. So the Muslim Brotherhood, during 2011, they decided, hey, something's happening. Let's get in there and try and get ahead of it. And they did. And they basically said, hey, this is a perfect opportunity to put in place a government that is both Muslim and honest. And so the Muslim Brotherhood, when the elections were held, Morsi, the head of Mr. Morsi, they recently died, became the president. That's when things came apart. His radical faction, which every Muslim Brotherhood has not been able to solve that problem. In fact, any Islamic organization, a party, whatever, they always have a radical faction which plays the "we are more Islamic than thou" card. Now, this is a serious problem, has been for over 1,000 years in Islam. There's no, Rome. There's no central authority everybody agrees on to settle important doctrinal, disputes. and because it is mentioned in the Quran that basically the Quran gives Islamic extremists justification. In other words, there are no breaks on them. There's no Islamic Pope. There's nothing in there. For example, the Bible, the Christian Bible and Jewish scripture does not have a lot of advice, practical advice, on how to lie, cheat, and steal and kill anyone who is not a Muslim. I mean, they're very explicit about that in the Quran. These guys, these Islamic terrorists, they're not making stuff up. It's there. Now, governments like Saudi Arabia, they point out that, well, it's subject to interpretation, but you don't always have basically a king, which is what Saudi Arabia is, a monarchy. It was founded by a guy who knew how to handle the Islamic radicals. That is rare. His sons have been basically adapting, not as well as their father or grandfather now did to it, but he's the model they're all trying to follow. But it's a very difficult problem because you're talking about true believers. They believe that, and you can read this. You can read the English translations of the Arabic newspapers. In the past, that wasn't available unless you were a scholar or worked for the CIA or the State Department, which translated it and then ignored it. A lot of people in these Muslim countries, they believe this. Now, Erdogan's deal was, let me get back to Egypt and finish that because a lot of people aren't aware of what happened there. All right, when the Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood, got in, and they had to basically set up, announce changes, how we're going to change the government, how we're going to deal with corruption. The radical wing, as it were, of the party got in front and said, all right, you must basically rule Egypt via Sharia law, no exceptions, no Sharia light. This is God's dictate, and there's no arguing about it. Well, the Egyptian people had been through this before, and they said, "Oh my God, we thought these guys had it under control. They didn't." There was a popular uprising. Morsi was overthrown. There was another election. And another former general, this named Sisi, not Mubarak, came into power. He basically restored peace. There's been prosperity, and there's of course ISIL and Al Qaeda and various other and radical radical factions of the Muslim Brotherhood still trying to make life miserable, or at least more Islamic, as they like to put it, for the Egyptian people. The popular opinion in Egypt is hostile to these guys, not because of their goals, their stated goals, but because one of their favorite tactics, which they can't get away from, is to attack the tourist industry and attack anything Western. And most Egyptians realize that if you're going to make a living in the 21st century or the 20th, you basically have to get what the Islamic radicals consider a Western education, a non-religious education. Tourists account for like 10% of the GDP. I mean, they are one of the pillars of the economy. And most Islamic radicals want to keep the foreigners out. They want to make war on Israel, which is not a viable foreign policy in that part of the world. They want to basically have lifestyle police going around, arresting women who don't cover up, men who don't have beards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't understand, and apparently, if you're an Islamic radical in Egypt or anyplace else, it doesn't make any difference. That doesn't fly in Egypt. Egypt has always been a little different, as far as Muslim countries go, and the Egyptians are proud of that. In other words, they say, well, we're practical Muslims, and they've never really tolerated the fanatics. But their fanatics are as fanatic as anybody else's fanatics. They think they're more clever, but they're not. They lose. Erdogan admires the Muslim Brotherhood. He doesn't say it out loud because he's smart enough to realize, well, this is not a popular thing. But there was ample evidence, after 2003, when he came in and he was basically the conduit for ISIL recruits and, supplies going to various Islamic radical rebel groups in Syria. It was possible if you knew the right people in the Erdogan government to get free passes through the border crossings. Now, he would never admit this, but again, the evidence piled up and piled up, namely from captured Islamic terrorists. They say, well, of course we got through. We knew so and so, and we just mentioned that name or that code word, whatever. And they say, all right, yeah, you're one of Erdogan's guys, or whatever. Turkey was split on this element. Erdogan, realizing that he has a problem with Turkish public opinion, which Austin points out, quite bluntly, most Turks do not want an Islamic government. They're not 100%, switched over to the Ataturk, secular form of government. But that's another problem with Islam. They have no, how should I put it, religiously correct way to separate church and state. That's a problem they have never been able to solve because, again, their scripture is quite explicit that there is no separate church and state. If you're a true Muslim, Sharia is the law of the land. There is no alternative. Whereas in the Bible, I don't know who put that in there. Well, I'm going to sound like a Christian heretic. But anyway, it states quite explicitly, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God. And there's basically not a lot of discussion in the Bible about having a religious government. I mean, the popes tried it during the Middle Ages by assuming that's why you have the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't work, and by the 1600s, when they had the Great Compromise after the big religious wars, the 30 Years' War, they basically agreed, all right, our official policy is there is no church domination of the government. Christians and Christians of all types, Catholics and these Protestants, or as the nuns used to say when I was in high school in the 50s, these rebels. We get along. I mean, that's basically, that has worked ever since. The Muslims have not had a moment like that. The Saudis, of all people, are trying to negotiate something like that. The Muslim reform movement, which they've been pushing for 2 decades now, it's not making a lot of headway because you've still got that scripture, and you can't change scripture because it's God's word and it's immutable, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem with Erdogan is, I'm sorry, I'm using the incorrect alternative pronunciation, is that he can apply the Muslim Brotherhood approach without, of course, calling it Muslim Brotherhood, because that's anathema in Turkey, and make it work. But nobody's made it work. And now he's taking heat from his the other Muslim majority countries in the region, because they don't trust him. He lies. In other words, he's following the Quran scripture, which says it's okay to lie to your heretics or non-Muslims. And he's seen as deceptive and, by some cynics, delusional. And he's not a real success. He's become corrupt. He's manipulating elections. As Austin points out, his attitude is a common one with Muslim politicians. We'll have elections until we don't need them anymore. In other words, until we have an Islamic State, which, of course, based upon past experience, it self-destructs after a while. I mean, nobody seems to get that. But it's a trope that's popular with a lot of Muslim countries with the politicians, because they, I'm on God's side, God's on my side, and all my opponents are heretics and godless, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't get that as much in the West anymore, because we basically sorted it out after several centuries of bloodshed over religious differences. The Jews, the same thing. The Hindus, to their credit, they're the largest polytheist, many gods religion in the world. They basically solved that a long time ago, and they basically used the old pre-Christian, Islam approach. Was we'll just accept any new god that comes along. If you're willing to have us, we're willing to have you. No, that goes against the there's only one God, and et cetera, et cetera. But be that as it may, it works for the Hindus. They have their extremists, but there's none of them can invoke my way or the highway. There's only one way, and Hindus must be, my version of Hinduism must be the only one. They don't have that. That is an essential problem in Islam, and Erdogan thought he could exploit it, but he couldn't. I mean, like Austin points out, that coup 3 years ago is very suspicious. It appears in hindsight now that it wasn't an organized coup per se. It was some guys in the Air Force decided we can do it all. Now, if you look at the history of coups in the last 100 years, since you had an Air Force, the Air Force, if a country had an Air Force, these were the most educated, technically the smartest, but considering the way they run coups, not the smartest, people in the military. They had a high opinion of themselves. That's something that still applies. And they could be insufferable and sometimes, outright rebellious. And that has happened before. And it doesn't work. I mean, it can work in theory, but that's what happens when you think you're the smartest guy in the armed forces and you're not. And somehow having airplanes makes you think that bingo, you can do anything. In fact, one of these stories circulating in Turkey now about why did Erdogan buy the S-400? It's because if he bought the Patriot, the Air Force would have access via NATO to the IFF, to the security measures, and Erdogan couldn't use the Patriots to shoot down his own Air Force. Whereas technically he can do that with the S-400 system, which will be installed by Russians. There'll be Russians there for a long time, reporting to Moscow and Erdogan. And this is a rumor, but it came from Turkey, so who knows? That may be what he's thinking. But he's basically, and he apparently is playing chicken with his NATO membership, because a lot of NATO members, not just the United States, are getting kind of fed up with this. I mean, during the Cold War, Turkey was a bulwark of NATO, because they were basically protecting that flank, and they were very much afraid of the Soviet Union, the Russians, because the Russians made no secret of the fact that if there was a war, they were going to basically come through Turkey, or try to come through Turkey. So the Turks never forgot that, but Erdogan has, because he feels, hey, now I can be friends with the Russians. Sure, hug the bear and see what happens. That's another, phrase that's popular with ancient enemies of Russia. And Putin, who is basically a declining economy, a declining population, and basically a how should I put it, an aging and obsolete military, is trying to basically stay in the game by making these sales, making these moves, making himself appear, in the tradition of Count Potemkin, much more powerful than he actually is. But we cover this regularly in Strategy Page, and it's sort of pathetic. I mean, there are so many ways. I mean, that's why we keep covering it. The new weapon systems and arsenal, and we point out that, well, in fact, this became obvious in Syria, where there was a whole category of new weapons which they used in Syria, but then they stopped using them. And the answer came out, and this came from Russia, was they only had a few. How should I put it? They had, display copies, display models, and that was it. There was no inventory of these high-tech weapons that they had gone to great expense to figure out how to produce smart bombs and what have you. Same with modern aircraft. And so Russia is even more desperate than Erdogan is, because the Turkish economy, although it's in a funk right now because of his mismanagement, is in better shape than the Russians are. So you can see what's going on here. You got paranoid people flailing around. Oh, another thing that hasn't come up yet is Erdogan got involved in Libya, supporting, naturally, the UN-approved Islamist government. There are two governments there. One is anti-Islamist and one is pro-Islamist. The one who's pro-Islamist is in Tripoli, based in Tripoli. All they have left of what they used to control, technically, half of Libya. All they have left is Tripoli, and that's now under siege by the Libyan National Army, the anti-Islamist group. And who is coming to the rescue of the Tripoli government? Erdogan, Turkey. Turkey sending in weapons, which is, a no-no. There's an embargo. He's sending in armored vehicles. He may have troops in there. He's threatening to officially invade Libya. And this is all because he backs up, Islamic rules light, which doesn't work. And he never seemed to figure that out, or maybe he doesn't want to. It made sense back in the late 90s with Islamic parties saying, look, let us get in power. There's a constitution in Turkey, the Ataturk constitution, which prevents an Islamic government from taking over. But we are honest, we are blah, blah, blah. And as Austin pointed out, he was honest for a while until he got power, and now he's as corrupt as the people he was, replacing. And Turks have noticed that. So, what are you going to do? When you get in, you get on the train until you can afford to get off and burn the railroad. The more and more Turks are finding this out. They don't want a civil war. Erdogan plays the Kurd card. The Kurds want to develop their own Kurdistan with eastern Turkey and parts of, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. But that's never going to happen because the Kurds can't get along with each other, but that's another story. Basically, Erdogan was supposed to be the solution to the corruption problem. Oh, by the way, let's mention that. The reason why corruption was such a big deal in Turkey wanted to get into the European Union, as did Greece. Greece managed to lie their way in. In other words, Greece and Turkey were both notorious. Actually, both those areas have been notorious since ancient Roman times. We have plenty of script. We have plenty of documents on that. The Romans were sort of, they were prissy prigs. They could be corrupt, but they had rule of law. And they enforced it more often than anybody else did. And that was an attraction back in those days. And they said, beware of the East. They're all corrupt. There's no, we can conquer them, but you can't turn them into honest Romans. That thing has changed in, 2,000 years. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia, one of the incentives was to basically steal all the money that corrupt, Persian imperial officials had stolen themselves and hidden away, and that was distributed as loot, as it were, to the various leaders. So things haven't changed. The Turks managed to convince the EU that, hey, we're honest. The Turks were less successful. The Greeks were eventually found out in 2007, and that triggered a huge, economic, how should I put it, collapse in Greece, which was basically bankrupt. They had borrowed more than they admitted they were borrowing. They couldn't pay it back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Turks were actually cleaning up their act more than the Greeks. But the Greeks had, hey, we're Europeans. We're not Muslims. Of course you can trust us. Well, let's not go into that. Anyway, the Turks, meanwhile, went with the Erdogan and said, well, we're Muslim, and I'm going to clean up the corruption more. And when he did that initially, that did improve economic, activity. The economy got stronger, as it usually does when you get the crooks out of the woodwork, the works. But now he's gone corrupt, and you basically need a friend of Erdogan, to basically get anything done. And they've gone right back. So Erdogan is bad news for himself, for Turkey, for NATO, you name it. Anything he touches basically turns to crap. And now he's doing it in Libya, and he basically is devoting all his resources to protecting himself from what he calls internal enemies. Basically, anybody who doesn't agree with him is an internal enemy. And as Austin pointed out, this coup in 3 years ago, which was a mini coup. I mean, it's weak by Greek standards. Their coups used to be, fairly well organized. Boom, boom, boom. Thousands of troops. Lockdown. It was over in 24 hours. No muss, no fuss. We'll basically try and clean things up and then hold elections again. Repeat cycle. That's been going on in Pakistan and in a few other countries for a long time.
Well, it sounds like it's going to continue to be a mess.
Look, the Turkish military, the Turkish army coups, they were swift, effective,
It didn't fail.
And they didn't fail. Look, the Turkish people got tired of what they called Praetorianism, where the military came in and knocked off the government, usually for corruption. Is one of the things that did it. Military is anti-Islamist in the sense of political Islamism, and has been, though Erdogan has gone around trying to change that, to get his promote officers who are sympathetic to him and sympathetic to him first, or loyal to him. He still hasn't managed to purge it completely, which is why he's still afraid of particularly the Turkish army. But that said, the people got, I mean, 80% of the Turkish public, including the Turkish Republican People's Party, Kemalists, the Kurdish Socialist Party, and AKP. We don't want them anymore. And that was one of Erdogan's pitches in the late 90s and in the first decade of this century, even after he'd gotten, his party had taken power. We're not going to have coups anymore. And that was popular. That was when he was on his anti-corruption kick. The thing is now, as Jim said, he's as corrupt as, well, the Kemalists became in the 80s and 90s. He may be even more corrupt when you look at this, at what he's done to educational institutions as well as financial institutions, and to what in Turkey had developed a responsible free press. What do I mean by that? I mean real tough criticism of Turkish politicians, tough criticism of the military, even when the military was in power. It was tolerated because this is a hallmark of a democracy, of a parliamentary democracy. I mean, you couldn't threaten to kill somebody. Well, you're not supposed to be able to do that in any civilized country. But for the most part, you wanted to write something and political criticism. It was tolerated. It was tolerated too if you wanted to criticize religious figures. There was a little bit more sensitivity about that, but I'm not just talking about Islamic figures. And this is going on from 70s, 80s, 90s into the first decade of this century. And then suddenly Erdogan is cracking down on criticism of Islam and also criticism of him. And that is something here. The Turks didn't want to have any more coups. Well, they don't want to lose their rights to free speech. And the other thing is that, Jim, when you're talking about the Islam on this and Egypt's problem with it, remember the Egyptians see themselves as Egyptians first. Yes. The Turks, we're not Arabs, and that's one of the things. We're ethnically a Turk, like the Kurds. We're ethnically Kurds, and the other thing is that it's forgotten in most cases, especially in the West. It's forgotten. It's not forgotten in Arab lands or North Africa. The Turks were the imperialists for centuries in those areas. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. There is some resentment on that part, but here's where Erdogan makes enemies in the region, is that he was going to be a neo-Ottomanist at one time. Remember that term, that we're going to have our own policy and extend Turkish power and influence. That was part of the reason his critics in Turkey said, "Hey, you just want to be a sultan, and look what Sultanism did to us. Compare our situation now as a secular republic with what we would be if we were under an Ottoman yoke, and that's was a term that the Greeks, when they were under Ottoman control, would use. So, Dan, I guess you couldn't say it better than what Jim did. Everything he touches, it becomes a bit of a mess, and a lot of it is just centered around his own desire for power.
And his own delusions. I mean, he basically doesn't catch the fact that, as Austin pointed out, the Ottoman centuries are not looked upon as the good old days in the subject provinces, in the conquered provinces. Egypt freed itself. The English came along, and they basically, well, the French did first, but then the English came along and they said, look, we'll offer you a deal. Yeah, we're imperialists, but we want to build a canal, and we want to do this, and we want to do that. But we basically don't want to, own Egypt forever. We'll basically do our business, and then you become independent. And that was just a business deal. With the Turks, they couldn't let go. They conquer an area, and instinctively they say, well, no, it's ours forever. Nothing is forever. The English understood that. The Turks did not. So, and of course, Erdogan doesn't understand that the former provinces, the former conquered territories, and we're talking about most of the Middle East and North Africa, that memory is part of their psyche. They do not want any return of the Turk. They're willing to, basically do business with the Turks, to trade with Turkey and what have you, but they don't want any more, Turkish overlords, because that did not work out well. And that's something I think a lot of Turks understand that. In fact, the Turks have a saying. Back in the 60s, I met this Turkish guy, nuclear physicist of all things, and he told me that they have a saying in Turkey: don't involve yourself with the affairs of the Arabs. In other words, most Turks, even though the official policy was they're our subjects, keep them under, control, most Turks were basically practical and said, look, we don't want to really get involved. And when Egypt basically broke away, there wasn't a lot of energy placed into reconquering Egypt because, as Austin pointed out, the Egyptians are different. In fact, that's another thing that doesn't get mentioned much. The Egyptians and most of the people in North Africa are basically Amazigh, or the Berbers, we call them. The ones who settled in basically the DNA analysis has basically confirmed this suspicion, as it were, this hypothesis. The ones who settled in Egypt, became the Egyptians, but the ones to the west from Libya, to Morocco, they basically were various local groups who were still had that culture. Now, when the Islamic invasion came along, a lot of them basically learned Arabic and said, all right, I'm now an Arab. But they weren't Arabs. In fact, in Libya and Algeria, a large, genetically, the majority of the people in both those countries are Berbers. But in both of them, you still have large minorities. I think it's about a third in Algeria who still identify as Berber. They still speak the Berber language. They're like the Kurds, as it were, as far as the Turks are concerned. They want basically Berber recognized as a second language. The wise thing to do would be let it happen. How long have they been doing this? How many thousand years? It's not going to end anytime soon. And this is why the Islam in North Africa is different. There are always local conditions, and actually, it's not just by North Africa. I mean, including Egypt. They are simply, Berbers who did real well. They got the Nile River, and they were able to found, one of the original, civilizations. But the Turks did not. The Turks, intrinsically understood that, but officially, Turks never recognized it. They're subject people. We should conquer them. And they just didn't, recognize history. It says, nobody's ever conquered Egypt. You might occupy it for a while, maybe 100, 200 years, but eventually they throw you out. And Erdogan, just doesn't get it, that there is not going to be any new, Turkish empire, because the old one didn't last because it was not popular, it was not wanted, and even many Turks, that's why Ataturk, was able to do what he was able to do, because most Turks agree. That's where that saying goes: don't get yourself involved with the affairs of the Turks, with the Arabs. And Erdogan basically Yeah, you're supposed to learn from history. He basically had a bad case of amnesia.
Yeah, well, we're up against the clock, so we'll wrap it up with that, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Take care, guys.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.